January 31, 1945, Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy noticed his hand slightly shaking as he photographed the aircraft in front of him, a fully intact Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber marked with tail number 763-12. He stared at it in disbelief. There is no way this could be a standard model. No serious Air Force would manufacture bombers like this. The aircraft's long cylindrical body glimmered under the tropical sunlight, perfectly matching the Allied description that compared it to a giant flying cigar. Nearly 20 meters stretched from its nose to its tail. Resting on its tricycle landing gear, the bomber looked sleek and complete. Its wings, spanning 25 meters, showed no signs of combat damage. The two 14-cylinder radial engines, each delivering roughly 1,500 horsepower, were untouched. This wasn't a wreck recovered from debris. It was a fully operational plane, abandoned by its pilots as U.S. forces advanced. Yet none of that was what consumed McCoy's full attention. What astonished him was discovered only after he opened the access panels and crawled inside the wings. The fuel tanks had zero protection. No self-sealing rubber lining. No armor plating. No fire control system. No protective coating of any kind. Only thin aluminum skin, barely 2 millimeters thick, separating massive storage of high-octane aviation fuel from any incoming bullets or tracer fire. Major McCoy, who led the Technical Air Intelligence Unit of the Southwest Pacific Command, had inspected numerous downed Japanese aircraft throughout the war. But nothing had prepared him for this. This bomber, left behind fully intact during the liberation of Clark Field, revealed a design philosophy so radically different from anything in Western aviation that it would take U.S. analysts months to fully understand its consequences. The calculations that would follow from this discovery would alter American tactics and influence aircraft design through the remainder of the war. Everything American pilots believed about Japanese technology, about what Japanese engineers were willing to sacrifice for superior performance, and about how little the imperial military valued the survival of its crews, was about to be dismantled by the evidence inside this single untouched bomber. The path leading to this revelation began 4 years earlier, on December 8, 1941. On that day, while Pearl Harbor was still burning, 82 G4M bombers and 26 G3M bombers took off from Formosa. Their destination, Clark Field, the main American airbase in the Philippines. The attack struck with perfect surprise. At 12:35 p.m., the Japanese squadrons approached at 20,000 feet, above the reach of American anti-aircraft fire. 27 bombers in the first formation released 636 bombs across Clark Field's runways and key installations. Minutes later, 0 fighters descended at treetop height, strafing and shredding any aircraft not destroyed in the initial bombardment. Out of 17 B-17 flying fortresses parked at the base, 12 were completely destroyed. Almost every P-40 Warhawk fighter on the airfield was reduced to burning debris. In less than 45 minutes, American aviation strength in the Philippines had been nearly wiped out. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few surviving U.S. pilots, watched from a bomb shelter as the Japanese aircraft headed back north. What stunned me was the way they approached, he later wrote in his combat report. Their formation was flawless, flying at high altitude, completely out of our reach. Then the fighters swept down and shattered us. We couldn't even launch a single aircraft. Despite the destruction, none of the Betty bombers themselves were struck. The few American fighters that eventually managed to take off arrived too late, finding an empty sky. The Japanese raid showcased the bomber's remarkable operational range, attacking from bases more than 460 miles away, something no American bomber was capable of at that time. During its first year in service, the Betty would prove devastatingly successful. On December 10, 1941, just 2 days after the assault on Clark Field, 26 G4M bombers joined older G3M Nell bombers to attack 4C, the British naval group built around the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The strike began shortly after 12:20 p.m. Japanese bombers approached in precisely coordinated waves, their torpedo attacks executed with such discipline that British witnesses were shocked. The Bettys carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, weighing 840 kilograms with a 205-kilogram warhead. These weapons were engineered specifically for shallow water use, traveling at depths capable of striking ships even close to shore. The torpedo squadrons concentrated their assault on the 2 large warships with deadly precision. Prince of Wales, a 43,000-ton battleship representing the newest class of British warship, was struck by at least 6 torpedoes, along with additional damage from high-altitude bombers. The blasts beneath the waterline tore open massive breaches in the hull, rapidly flooding compartments and overwhelming damage control teams. The ship soon began to list heavily. Repulse, a World War I-era battlecruiser upgraded during the 1930s, was hit at least 4 times while attempting evasive maneuvers. Although the ship's anti-aircraft guns managed to bring down some Japanese aircraft, the defensive fire could not break the coordinated torpedo attacks. The combined damage proved lethal. Both major warships capsized and sank within hours. Prince of Wales went down at approximately 13:20. Repulse followed roughly 13 minutes later at about 13:33. A total of 841 British sailors were killed, with survivors rescued by accompanying destroyers. The entire battle lasted less than 2 hours, from the first sighting to the sinking of both capital ships. It marked the first time in naval history that fully active, maneuvering battleships had been destroyed entirely by air power in open waters. The G4M Betty bomber accomplished what naval strategists had argued over for years. In just an hour and a half, British dominance in Asian waters was destroyed. Throughout the Pacific theater in early 1942, American and Allied pilots repeatedly encountered Betty bombers in nearly every significant battle. The aircraft appeared to operate without restraint, attacking targets at distances that seemed impossible by conventional standards. They struck Darwin, Australia, from bases over 1,500 miles away, proving a reach that surpassed the capabilities of any Allied bomber. They launched attacks on Port Moresby from airfields across the mountain chains of New Guinea, constantly applying pressure to Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific. They bombed Guadalcanal from Rabaul, more than 600 miles away, projecting Japanese aviation power across huge stretches of ocean. The Betty's extraordinary range gave Japanese forces a level of strategic mobility that Allied commanders struggled to match. American fighters stationed in forward areas lacked the endurance to intercept Betty bombers taking off from distant Japanese facilities. Allied bases were under threat from aircraft that were themselves unreachable by Allied airstrikes. This imbalance meant Japanese forces could launch attacks at will while Allied units lacked the means to effectively respond. This advantage held firm during the first half-year of the conflict. Betty bombers were present in almost every Japanese offensive movement across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. They hit targets throughout the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. They supported naval operations everywhere in the theater. They conducted reconnaissance missions farther than any Allied aircraft could reach. The Betty quickly became the emblem of Japanese long-range air superiority. But this success relied completely on facing little to no Allied fighter resistance. When Betty formations could approach targets without interception, when they flew at altitudes beyond the range of anti-aircraft guns, when they delivered their payloads and withdrew before any fighters arrived, the bomber proved shockingly effective. These conditions defined the early months of 1942, when Allied aviation remained thin and scattered. By the middle of 1942, however, circumstances started shifting. As American fighter numbers increased, as the outdated Wildcats were replaced by more advanced Hellcats and Corsairs, as pilot training improved and tactics evolved, Betty crews began to experience alarming casualty rates. The turning point became unmistakable on August 8, 1942. That day, 23 G4M bombers from the 4th Air Group flew out of Rabaul to strike U.S. forces on Guadalcanal. American fighters intercepted them over Savo Island. In the ensuing battle, 18 of the 23 Bettys were destroyed. Roughly 120 Japanese airmen died in what became the largest single loss of G4M bombers during the entire conflict. Fighter pilots repeatedly observed the same troubling characteristic: the Betty burst into fire with very little damage. 2 or 3 hits anywhere along the fuselage or wings resulted in catastrophic destruction. The aircraft quickly earned ominous nicknames that spread throughout American squadrons: Flying Cigar, 1OT Lighter, Flying Zippo, all references to the Betty's terrifying tendency to ignite instantly when damaged. By October 1942, when Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn arrived at Guadalcanal commanding VF-17, Flying F-4U Corsairs, the Betty's deadly reputation had become widely known. "The first time we engaged a Betty formation, we couldn't believe how easily they went down," Blackburn later reported. "Hit them anywhere on the fuselage or wings, and they would erupt in flames. We actively hunted them, recognizing them as among the most vulnerable targets in the Pacific skies." However, the full scope of the Betty's vulnerability and the engineering decisions that made such catastrophic losses inevitable would not be completely understood until American forces captured intact examples for detailed examination. The first major intelligence breakthrough occurred in November 1942, when Australian forces overran Japanese airfields at Buna in Papua New Guinea. Among the abandoned aircraft, Allied technical air intelligence units discovered Betty bombers in varying conditions of damage. Initial inspections confirmed the pilot's observations: the fuel tanks had absolutely no protection. Aeronautical engineers from the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit in the Southwest Pacific conducted thorough analyses. Wing access panels revealed fuel cells with no protective measures, thin aluminum construction, no rubber sealant layers, no protective coatings, no fire suppression systems. Multiple Bettys examined at Buna displayed identical characteristics. This was not a result of battle damage or field modifications, it was the standard Japanese design. The implications were staggering. By 1942, American bombers universally incorporated self-sealing fuel tanks. The B-17 Flying Fortress had included them from the B-17C model onward, and the B-24 Liberator had featured them from the ex-B-24B prototype. Even American fighters like the P-38 and P-47 used protected fuel systems. Self-sealing tanks employed layered rubber compounds that swelled when punctured, sealing holes and preventing fuel leaks or fires. While this technology added significant weight to the aircraft, it dramatically improved crew survival rates. American military doctrine considered this weight penalty essential and non-negotiable. In stark contrast, Japan's primary land-based bomber, produced in the thousands and operating across the entire Pacific, relied on fuel tanks that offered zero protection. The weight savings from eliminating self-sealing systems, armor plating, and fire suppression equipment were immediately apparent, but the human cost was devastating, reflected in loss statistics that grew with every engagement. The Betty captured at Clark Field in January 1945 offered the most comprehensive technical analysis of the aircraft to date. Major McCoy and his team spent 3 weeks carefully dismantling and documenting every system. Their findings were classified as secret and distributed to all Allied air forces, providing detailed specifications that explained both the G4M Betty's exceptional performance and its glaring vulnerabilities. The G4M Model 1 specifications revealed a bomber ruthlessly optimized for range and speed. Its empty weight was 6,741 kilograms, remarkably light for an aircraft of its size. Maximum takeoff weight reached 9,500 kilograms, and fuel capacity totaled 4,780 liters, divided among 8 unprotected tanks, 4 in each wing, positioned in the center section of the wings, where they were most exposed to enemy fire. The aircraft could reach a top speed of 428 km per hour, approximately 265 miles per hour, with a maximum range of 6,340 kilometers, over 3,700 miles, and a service ceiling of 8,500 meters. The crew comprised 7 members: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 2 gunners. The fuel system design proved particularly revealing. The 8 tanks were arranged in 4 pairs along the wing's longitudinal axis, where the wing connected to the fuselage. This placement maximized fuel capacity by utilizing the thickest portion of the wing structure, but it also made the tanks extremely vulnerable to enemy fire. Any attack from the side or below could strike the tanks directly. The aluminum construction offered no protection, and the absence of self-sealing compounds meant that even minor punctures would result in continuous fuel leakage. American engineers calculated that eliminating protective systems saved over 500 kilograms per aircraft. This weight reduction increased fuel capacity and extended operational range. However, the trade-off was stark. Combat reports confirmed that Betty bombers hit anywhere in the wing area almost always exploded. The unprotected tanks created what engineers called a critical failure point, a single system whose destruction guaranteed the loss of the entire aircraft. These figures reflected deliberate design choices dating back to September 1937, when the Japanese Navy issued requirements that would define the G4M's entire development. The Navy demanded a top speed of 398 km per hour, a cruising altitude of 3,000 meters, and a range of 4,722 km unloaded, or 3,700 km carrying 800 kilograms of bombs or torpedoes. These requirements were shaped by Japanese naval strategy in the late 1930s. Japan's empire spanned vast distances across the Pacific, with naval bases separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. The Navy required bombers capable of striking enemy targets far beyond the reach of carrier-based aircraft. The goal was to create bombers capable of operating from land bases to support naval operations throughout the entire theater. Existing Japanese bombers fell far short of these ambitious requirements. The G4M Nell bomber, which was in service at the time, had a maximum range of approximately 3,000 kilometers. Early variants of American bombers, such as the B-17, had even more limited range. In fact, no bomber in service anywhere in the world in the 1930s could strike targets at the distances envisioned by Japanese planners. The Navy's requirements were not arbitrary, they were carefully calculated based on the distances Japanese forces would need to cover in any potential Pacific conflict. From Formosa to the Philippines, the distance was roughly 460 miles. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal, approximately 600 miles. From the Japanese home islands to potential targets across the Pacific, distances stretched into the thousands of miles. A bomber capable of meeting these requirements would grant Japan strategic reach unmatched by any other nation. However, these requirements also rested on assumptions about future warfare that would ultimately prove disastrously incorrect. Japanese planners believed that surprise and initiative would protect long-range bombers. They assumed enemy fighter opposition would be limited by range and numbers. They further assumed that the war would be decided quickly, before enemy industrial capacity could produce overwhelming force. Every single assumption turned out to be false. The task of achieving the seemingly impossible fell to Kiro Honjo, who took over Mitsubishi's design team from Joji Hattori. Honjo had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany during the early 1930s, absorbing European aeronautical engineering principles and production techniques before returning to Japan. He immediately recognized that meeting the Navy's ambitious requirements would necessitate compromises that Western air forces would never accept. Honjo assembled a team of engineers at Mitsubishi's Nagoya facilities to tackle the design challenges. The team analyzed every aspect of bomber design, calculating precise weight budgets for each component and system. They studied existing bombers from multiple nations, identifying areas where weight could be reduced without compromising structural integrity. They experimented with innovative construction techniques and materials to achieve further weight savings. The mathematics were brutally simple. To achieve the required operational range, the aircraft needed massive fuel capacity. Each liter of aviation fuel weighed approximately 0.8 kilograms, so the 4,780 liters required at full load added nearly 3,800 kilograms of fuel weight. To reach the necessary speed while carrying this fuel, the aircraft had to remain exceptionally lightweight. Every additional kilogram added to the empty weight reduced either range or payload capacity. These requirements were in direct conflict. Fuel was heavy, and protective systems were also heavy. Armor plating, weighing hundreds of kilograms, would be needed to safeguard crew positions and vital systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks added substantial weight due to the rubber compounds and additional structural components required. Fire suppression systems added additional weight. Redundant safety mechanisms contributed even more mass. The cumulative weight required for adequate protection would have made it impossible to meet the G4M's performance requirements. Kiro Honjo faced a defining decision that would shape the G4M throughout its operational life. Protection would be sacrificed entirely in favor of performance. The fuel tanks would remain unprotected, made of simple aluminum, with no self-sealing compounds, no armor plating surrounding the fuel cells, and no sophisticated fire suppression beyond basic extinguishers. Any extra weight saved would be allocated directly to increasing fuel capacity, extending range, and achieving the Navy's stringent performance specifications. This decision was made with full awareness of the risks. Honjo and his engineering team calculated the vulnerabilities that leaving the fuel tanks exposed would create. They knew that even minor combat damage to the wings could have catastrophic consequences. Yet they also recognized that meeting the Navy's requirements was impossible with existing technology if full protection were added. The choice was stark: an aircraft capable of meeting all performance specifications but with known fatal vulnerabilities, or an aircraft that was better protected but failed to meet critical operational requirements. The Navy had demanded performance. Honjo delivered it. The first G4M prototype took to the skies on October 23, 1939. The aircraft fulfilled every performance requirement set by the Navy. Speed exceeded expectations. Range surpassed projections. Payload capacity met operational needs. Production began under Mitsubishi at plants in Nagoya, with initial G4M Model 1 units entering service in April 1941. By December 1941, roughly 180 G4MS were operational, forming the backbone of Japanese land-based air power throughout the Pacific War. The Betty's combat debut at Clark Field and against Force Z demonstrated the strategic wisdom of Honjo's design priorities under the specific conditions of early 1942. When opposition was limited, when surprise could be achieved, and when operations extended beyond the range of enemy fighters, the Betty was devastatingly effective. Its extended range allowed strikes from bases the Allies considered secure. Its speed enabled rapid penetration into target areas. Its payload delivered significant operational impact. However, all of these advantages relied entirely on the assumption of minimal opposition. The moment American fighter strength increased, the moment interception became routine, and the moment sustained combat engagements became inevitable, every design choice favoring range over protection became a death sentence for the crews. The Guadalcanal campaign revealed the fundamental flaw in the Betty's design philosophy. Between August and October 1942, more than 100 G4M bombers were lost along with their crews in a prolonged and unsustainable bloodletting that Japanese air forces could not endure. A single mission on August 8 alone saw 18 of 23 bombers destroyed, resulting in approximately 120 aviators killed. The pattern repeated with relentless and brutal consistency throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. Betty bomber formations departed from Rabaul, flew the 600-mile distance to Guadalcanal, engaged American fighter defenses, and suffered devastating losses. On August 9, additional bombers were destroyed. August 10 brought further casualties. By the end of August, the 4th Air Group had been effectively eliminated as a functioning operational unit. September offered no respite. Betty formations continued their strikes against American positions at Guadalcanal, while American fighters systematically destroyed them in overwhelming numbers. The arithmetic was merciless. Japanese forces had to strike American positions to contest control of the island. Betty bombers were the only aircraft capable of delivering meaningful offensive power from Rabaul. Yet every mission inflicted losses that could not be replaced. In October, the pattern persisted. American fighter strength increased with the arrival of additional squadrons at Henderson Field. Pilot skill improved with accumulating combat experience, and tactical doctrine evolved to exploit the Betty's vulnerabilities with increasing efficiency. Japanese losses accelerated even as the number of bombers available for missions dwindled. By November, as the Guadalcanal campaign concluded with the Japanese withdrawal, Betty losses had surpassed 100 aircraft, with approximately 700 crewmen killed. The attrition rate was unsustainable. Japan's most advanced land-based bomber had been rendered functionally obsolete by its own design flaws, transforming from a feared weapon into what American pilots derisively called easy meat. Japanese planners had anticipated losses. Military operations inevitably involved casualties, but the scale of Betty losses exceeded every projection. The unprotected fuel tanks that enabled a 6,000-kilometer range simultaneously guaranteed that almost any hit to the wings or fuselage would be catastrophic. There was no middle ground, no damaged but recoverable aircraft. Betty bombers either returned untouched or were destroyed in flames. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers recognized the necessity of modifications. Beginning with the 663rd aircraft produced in March 1943, 30mm rubber sheets were installed beneath the wing surfaces covering the fuel tanks. These sheets were not true self-sealing tanks, rather, they represented a compromise, adding minimal weight while providing limited protection against fuel leakage. The modification reduced top speed by 9 km per hour and decreased maximum range by 315 km, yet crew survival rates showed little improvement. The rubber sheets could slow fuel leakage from small-caliber rounds but could not prevent fires from larger bullets or cannon shells, nor stop explosions triggered by tracers igniting fuel vapor. The fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. Japanese designers attempted more extensive protection with the introduction of the G4M Model 3 in October 1944. This version of the aircraft incorporated genuine self-sealing fuel tanks, though capacity was reduced to 4,490 liters to accommodate the leak-blocking material. This adjustment reduced the maximum range to 3,640 kilometers, a loss exceeding 2,000 kilometers compared to the original G4M Model 1. By the end of the war, roughly 60 G4M Model 3 bombers had been produced. However, the modification arrived too late and in too limited numbers to alter the Betty's combat record. By late 1944, American air superiority was so overwhelming that no level of fuel tank protection could have allowed Betty bombers to operate effectively. The outcome of the war was already decided. The Betty's vulnerability had become so widely recognized that American forces began employing the aircraft in ways that exposed the extreme risks faced by Japanese crews. On April 18, 1943, a Betty bomber played a central role in the mission that resulted in Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death, an operation that showcased both American signals intelligence capabilities and the deadly weaknesses of the G4M. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications revealing that Yamamoto would travel from Rabaul to Binville on that date, aboard a G4M bomber escorted by fighter aircraft. 18 P-38 Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron were assigned to intercept the flight, though only 16 executed the mission after one plane suffered a blown tire on takeoff and another experienced drop tank failure. The mission demanded exceptional precision. The P-38s would fly over 400 miles at wavetop altitude to evade radar detection, navigate across open ocean without visible landmarks, and arrive at the exact calculated intercept point at the precise scheduled time. Any navigational error or deviation in timing would result in failure. The intercept window was narrow, and Yamamoto's aircraft would only be vulnerable for a brief moment. The P-38s departed Guadalcanal at 7:25 hours, maintaining strict radio silence while flying 50 feet above the ocean for over 400 miles. Navigation relied entirely on dead reckoning and precise timing. The formation arrived at the calculated intercept point with legendary accuracy. At 9:34 hours, exactly on schedule and 1 minute ahead of the planned intercept, the P-38 spotted Yamamoto's formation, 2 Betty bombers flying at low altitude, accompanied by 6 Zero fighters as escort. Captain Thomas Lanphier and First Lieutenant Rex Barber broke from the formation to engage the bombers directly, while the remaining P-38s focused on holding off the Zero fighters. First Lieutenant Rex Barber engaged the lead Betty bomber, which carried Admiral Yamamoto. The aircraft sustained hits in the wing area where the unprotected fuel tanks were positioned. Instantly, the bomber erupted into flames and plummeted into the jungle. Yamamoto's body was recovered, and the following day, it was confirmed that he had died from injuries sustained during the crash. The second Betty bomber also went down, killing everyone on board. This operation highlighted several critical aspects of Allied superiority. American signals intelligence had successfully intercepted and decoded Japanese communications. Meticulous American planning ensured the intercept occurred with 1-minute precision across 400 miles of open ocean. The American pilots executed the mission flawlessly despite extreme navigational challenges. Additionally, the inherent vulnerabilities of the Betty bombers ensured that any successful interception would be catastrophic. Yamamoto's aircraft had no chance of surviving once it came under fire. The unprotected fuel tanks made any damage instantly fatal. The Betty's vulnerability would be demonstrated once again in a dramatic display on March 21, 1945. 18 G4M bombers departed Koya Air Base, each equipped with an MXY-7 Oker rocket aircraft mounted beneath its fuselage. The Oker was a piloted, rocket-powered aircraft carrying a 1,200-kilogram warhead, specifically designed for kamikaze attacks against American ships. For the mission to succeed, the Betty bombers needed to approach within 20 kilometers of their targets before releasing the Oker. Once released, the Oker pilot would ignite the rocket engine and dive at speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour toward the target. The warhead's explosive force was sufficient to destroy any ship it struck, but the mission relied entirely on the Betty bombers surviving long enough to reach release range. The formation departed Koya at approximately 14:30 hours. The 18 bombers flew in tight formation with fighter escort toward American naval forces off Okinawa. Each aircraft carried the heavy Oker beneath its fuselage, significantly increasing weight and drag, reducing speed and maneuverability. This additional load made the bombers even more vulnerable, limiting their ability to evade or maneuver under fire. American radar detected the formation at roughly 100 miles distance. F-6F Hellcat fighters from the USS Hornet were scrambled to intercept. They reached the Japanese formation well before the Betty bombers could reach release range for their Oker weapons. In the ensuing engagement, American fighters systematically destroyed the entire formation. Already vulnerable under normal conditions, the Betty bombers proved completely helpless while carrying the Oker. The extra weight restricted evasive maneuvers, the added drag further reduced speed, and the unprotected fuel tanks ensured that any hit was instantly fatal. One by one, the bombers exploded and crashed into the ocean. Not a single Betty bomber survived long enough to release its Oker weapon. Every Oker pilot perished. In total, 137 bomber crew members and 15 Oker pilots were killed in the attack. This mission exemplified the fundamental flaw of the G4M Betty. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons over long distances could not survive to fulfill its mission when confronted with prepared opposition. Its exceptional theoretical range proved meaningless when the aircraft was destroyed before reaching the point where its weapons could be deployed. The final mission undertaken by Betty bombers occurred on August 19, 1945, just 4 days after Emperor Hirohito formally announced Japan's surrender. 2 G4M bombers, painted white and adorned with green crosses, departed from Atsugi airfield carrying Japanese representatives tasked with negotiating surrender terms with Allied forces. These aircraft, designated Baton 1 and Baton 2, flew to Ishima, where the Japanese delegation transferred to an American C-54 transport for the journey to Manila. The symbolism of this flight was deliberate and profound. The white paint and green crosses signified peaceful intentions, transforming the bombers from instruments of war into vehicles of diplomacy. The call signs Baton 1 and Baton 2 referenced the location where American forces had surrendered to Japan in April 1942, one of the most catastrophic defeats in American military history. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing the same call signs carried Japan's surrender delegation. Lieutenant Den Suno piloted one of the surrender aircraft, a G4M Model 1 transport variant adapted from the bomber airframe. These transport versions retained the Betty's characteristic cylindrical fuselage and wing design but were configured to carry passengers and cargo instead of weapons. The crew wore formal dress uniforms rather than standard flight suits. The aircraft were completely unarmed, carrying no weapons, ammunition, or military equipment beyond what was required for flight. The flight from Atsugi to Ishima spanned roughly 1,000 kilometers, well within the Betty's operational range, even in its transport configuration. American fighter escorts accompanied the White Betty bombers for the entire journey, both to ensure their safety and to supervise adherence to the designated flight path. The escorts guaranteed that the aircraft remained on the prescribed course, preventing any deviation or potential incident. These white-painted Betty bombers with green crosses provided the final image of the aircraft that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field in December 1941. The circle of history was complete. The same type of bomber that had decimated American air power in the initial hours of the war now carried Japan's surrender delegation in the conflict's closing days. The aircraft that had once symbolized the reach and effectiveness of Japanese air power now embodied Japan's defeat and submission to Allied authority. The production numbers of the Betty reflect both its central role in Japanese operations and the consequences of its design philosophy. Approximately 2,414 aircraft were produced across all variants, though some sources report totals as high as 2,435 when including all prototypes and subtypes. Discrepancies in totals arise from differing methods of counting prototypes, subtypes, and transport versions. The G4M Model 1 accounted for roughly 1,172 aircraft produced between 1941 and early 1943. This variant featured the original unprotected fuel tank design with a capacity of 4,780 liters and achieved a top speed of 428 km per hour. The G4M Model 1 achieved a maximum range of 6,034 kilometers, making it the longest-ranged bomber in active service anywhere in the world. However, the total lack of protection systems rendered it catastrophically vulnerable once American fighter strength increased. The G4M Model 2, which featured increased fuel capacity and a slightly higher top speed, accounted for roughly 1,142 aircraft produced between 1943 and 1945. This variant expanded fuel capacity to 6,490 liters, further extending its maximum operational range. Its top speed rose marginally to 437 km per hour, yet the Model 2 retained the core vulnerability of unprotected fuel tanks. These modifications improved performance but did nothing to enhance survivability. The G4M Model 3, also known as Model 34, was the only variant equipped with genuine self-sealing fuel tanks. Production of this variant began in October 1944, but only 60 to 91 aircraft were completed by the end of the war, depending on the source. The self-sealing tanks reduced fuel capacity to 4,490 liters to accommodate the leak-blocking materials, which in turn lowered the maximum range to 3,640 kilometers, a reduction of over 2,000 kilometers compared to the Model 1. These changes were implemented too late and in too few numbers to impact combat outcomes meaningfully. The G6M transport variant, adapted from existing bomber airframes, added another 30 aircraft to the total. These transport versions carried personnel and cargo rather than weapons, serving primarily in liaison and communications roles. One G6M Model 1 was used as part of the surrender mission in August 1945. Production of the Betty continued through August 1945, with the last aircraft completed just days before Japan's official surrender. At peak output in 1943, Mitsubishi factories produced approximately 100 Betty bombers per month. Production declined in 1944 and 1945 due to Allied bombing campaigns that disrupted Japanese industry and the diversion of resources to fighter aircraft for homeland defense. These production figures made the Betty one of Japan's most numerous bombers, exceeded only by certain fighter types in total output. Over 4 years of war, Mitsubishi delivered roughly 2,400 aircraft to Japanese Navy units operating across the Pacific Theater. Betty bombers participated in every major campaign, took part in all significant naval engagements, and struck targets over distances spanning thousands of kilometers. Yet production numbers alone tell only part of the story, loss rates complete the picture. Very few Betty bombers survived to the end of the war. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by the fires that their unprotected fuel tanks made almost inevitable. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, only a small handful of operational Betty bombers remained in service. The aircraft that had numbered in the hundreds in 1942 had been reduced to mere dozens due to attrition that no amount of production could offset. Casualty rates among Betty crews were similarly catastrophic, though exact figures remained difficult to verify from surviving records. What is certain is that thousands of Japanese aircrew perished aboard Betty bombers, their deaths rendered nearly unavoidable by the aircraft's fundamental design vulnerabilities. The crews were fully aware of the overwhelming risks, yet they flew regardless because both military discipline and deeply ingrained cultural values demanded they accept those dangers without question. Survivors of Betty bomber missions consistently concluded the same: the aircraft's unprotected fuel tanks made survival entirely a matter of chance. No degree of skill, no tactical ingenuity, and no amount of courage could overcome the fundamental vulnerability inherent in every G4M. Former Flight Petty Officer Masawato, who completed 28 combat missions before being transferred to training duties, summarized the reality bluntly: the Betty was a magnificent aircraft, but it demanded our lives for the sake of its range. We flew it because we were ordered to. We died in it because that was the purpose for which it was designed. When compared with Allied bomber protection systems, the contrast in design philosophy becomes stark. The B-17 Flying Fortress featured armor plating around the pilot and co-pilot seats, with steel plates ranging from 0.3 to 0.31 inches thick. Bulkheads protected crew positions throughout the fuselage, while the bombardier's station incorporated armored glass. Waist gunner positions were shielded, and self-sealing fuel tanks were standard from the B-17C model onward. Introduced in 1941, the B-25 Mitchell incorporated similar protection measures, including armored seats for the pilot and co-pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks from early production. The B-25's empty weight of roughly 9,100 kilograms reflected the substantial weight penalty of these protection systems, roughly 2,000 kilograms heavier than the Betty despite a similar size and role. For Allied forces, this weight penalty was substantial but accepted as necessary. Wartime studies confirmed the effectiveness of these protective measures. Body armor reduced thoracic wound fatalities from 36% to 8%, a reduction of over 75% in deaths from chest wounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks produced similar reductions in fire-related casualties. Aircraft with protected fuel systems survived combat damage 3 to 4 times more often than unprotected aircraft. Shielded crew positions minimized the effects of shell fragments and small arms fire, armored glass prevented pilot casualties during frontal attacks, and bulkheads compartmentalized the fuselage to contain damage and fire. This comprehensive approach reflected American military doctrine. Experienced crews were considered assets more valuable than the aircraft themselves, which could be replaced more easily than trained veterans. While the weight cost for protection exceeded 1,000 pounds in most American bombers, U.S. industrial capacity allowed production of large numbers without compromising operational capability. During the war, over 12,000 B-17s and nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators were produced, enabling American forces to field substantial fleets of protected bombers. Japanese doctrine, by contrast, reached entirely different conclusions. The Betty's design prioritized range and striking power above crew survival. This philosophy assumed that maintaining surprise and initiative would serve as sufficient protection, that enemy opposition would remain limited, and that the war would be short and decisive. Every one of these assumptions proved catastrophically incorrect. By mid-1942, American fighter strength had grown to levels that made Betty interception routine. By late 1942, U.S. pilots had learned to exploit every weakness in the Betty's design. By 1943, missions had become effectively suicidal, with losses mounting on a scale that Japanese forces could not replace. By 1944, Betty bombers were barely able to operate in daylight against increasingly capable American opposition. The mathematics of the Betty's war were written in fire and loss. Every advantage that initially made the aircraft formidable became meaningless under sustained combat. Range meant nothing when bombers exploded before reaching targets. Speed meant nothing when fighters could intercept from distant bases. Payload meant nothing when entire formations were destroyed before they could release their weapons. The examination of tail number 763-12 at Clark Field in January 1945 revealed the full story. The unprotected fuel tanks that shocked Major McCoy were not a mistake, a temporary compromise, or an engineering oversight. They were the deliberate choice of designers who valued range above survival. Japanese engineers had created precisely what their specifications demanded, an aircraft optimized for extraordinary speed and range while minimizing weight to meet the Navy's performance requirements. Protection would have prevented the aircraft from meeting those specifications. Within the constraints of 1937 technology and assumptions about future warfare, this decision made perfect sense. However, those assumptions collapsed under the reality of sustained combat against an opponent with unlimited industrial capacity and rapidly improving technology. The Betty bomber became the ultimate symbol of Japan's willingness to accept catastrophic casualties in pursuit of tactical advantage. It became evidence of a military culture that placed mission accomplishment above crew survival. When American engineers examined the intact Betty at Clark Field, they were not merely analyzing an enemy aircraft, they were observing the tangible result of design choices made years earlier, choices that prioritized capability at the expense of human life, costing thousands of Japanese aircrew their lives. The unprotected fuel tanks were a decision, not an accident. The Betty served from the opening day of the Pacific War to its very end. It sank capital ships, devastated airfields, and operated across distances no other bomber could match. Yet its ultimate legacy is defined by loss statistics far exceeding projections. The aircraft that had destroyed American air power at Clark Field at the war's beginning ended the war carrying Japan's surrender delegation in white-painted planes marked with green crosses. The crew of tail number 763-12 survived only by abandoning their aircraft during the American advance at Clark Field, escaping from a machine whose design made survival nearly impossible. Most Betty crews were not so fortunate. They flew their missions fully aware of the dangers that awaited them. They climbed into unprotected Betty bombers, traversed vast stretches of the Pacific, and perished in overwhelming numbers, consumed by fires that the aircraft's very design made inevitable. The story of the Betty bomber ultimately illustrates the cost of capability without protection. It shows that raw performance alone cannot ensure success when that performance comes at the expense of crew survival. The extraordinary range of 6,000 kilometers was meaningless if the aircraft could not endure the final 100 kilometers to its target. The impressive top speed of 428 km per hour provided no advantage when American fighters, guided by radar warnings, could intercept from distant bases. Even a payload capacity of 1 ton became irrelevant when entire formations were destroyed before any weapons could be deployed. Most critically, the Betty reveals that military technology divorced from a realistic understanding of combat conditions can produce weapons that are just as deadly to their own crews as they are to the enemy. The assumptions underpinning the Betty's design, expectations of limited opposition and a short, decisive war, proved catastrophically wrong within mere months of the Pacific War's outbreak. By the time those assumptions were invalidated, thousands of Betty bombers were already in service or under production, and Japan lacked the industrial capacity to replace them with designs that prioritized protection. Japanese designers understood the risks when they made their choices in 1937 and 1938. They calculated the weight penalties. They recognized the vulnerabilities. They consciously accepted these trade-offs, believing the performance advantages would determine victory. They were mistaken, and thousands of men paid the ultimate price for that miscalculation. The legacy of the Betty bomber extends far beyond aviation history. It raises enduring questions about aircraft design philosophy, military ethics, acceptable risk, and the value of human life in warfare. American designers answered those questions by prioritizing crew protection, even if it meant sacrificing raw performance. Japanese designers answered differently, placing mission performance and range above the lives of their aircrew. The thousands of burning Betty bombers scattered across the Pacific sky embodied the consequences of that philosophical divergence, highlighting the fundamental difference in how nations approached warfare in the Pacific theater. American forces designed aircraft to return their crews safely. Japanese forces designed aircraft to reach targets, regardless of cost. In the end, the nation that valued crew survival created an air force capable of sustaining operations indefinitely. The nation that accepted catastrophic casualties for marginal performance advantages built an air force that ultimately destroyed itself through attrition. The examination of tail number 763-12 at Clark Field provided the definitive confirmation of what Allied forces had long suspected: the Betty bomber was not poorly designed. It was brilliantly engineered to achieve specific goals. Those goals simply did not include bringing Japanese crews home alive. In that single fact lies the entire story of why Japan lost the Pacific.